Gisons, a city of whispers, Hierapolis. The moon hangs like a silver coin above the ancient city of Hierapolis, casting its gentle light across marble columns and thermal pools that steam softly in the night air. Here, where the earth breathes warm mineral waters through limestone terraces, where Roman citizens come to heal their bodies in sacred springs. Here, in this city of whispers and wonder, our story begins. You can almost hear it, can't you? The soft murmur of water flowing over white stone, the distant echo of footsteps on marble pathways, the rustle of silk and linen as the last visitors of the day make their way home through streets that have witnessed centuries of human longing, human hope, human endurance. This is Hierapolis, in the heart of ancient Phrygia, where Asia meets the Mediterranean world under Rome's vast embrace. The year is somewhere in the 1st century of the Common Era, a time when the empire stretches from Britain's misty shores to the deserts of Egypt, when trade routes carry not just goods but ideas, philosophies, and stories across continents. But tonight we're not here for the grandeur of empire. We're here for something quieter, something deeper. We're here for the kind of truth that doesn't announce itself with trumpets and proclamations, but whispers itself into existence in the spaces between heartbeats. The thermal pools of Hierapolis have drawn travelers for generations. They come seeking healing, some for bodies worn down by labor, others for spirits crushed by circumstance. The waters are said to cure everything from rheumatism to heartbreak, though perhaps what really heals is simply the act of stepping away from the world's demands long enough to remember who you are beneath all the roles you play. In the fading light of evening, you might see them, figures moving slowly through the colonnaded streets. A merchant's wife from Ephesus, her shoulders finally relaxing after months of managing household accounts and social obligations. A veteran from the Germanic campaigns, learning to walk again not just on wounded legs, but with a wounded soul. A young mother whose children are finally old enough that she can steal away for a few days to remember the woman she was before she became everything to everyone else. They come to these healing waters carrying invisible burdens, the weight of others' expectations, the exhaustion of constantly performing the person they think they should be, the bone-deep tiredness that comes not from physical labor, but from the emotional labor of holding space for everyone else's needs while somehow losing track of their own. Does this sound familiar? This ancient exhaustion that feels so thoroughly modern? The city itself seems to understand. Hierapolis means sacred city, but there's nothing austere about its sacredness. This is a place that honors both body and spirit, that recognizes healing as something that happens not through denial of human needs, but through their gentle tending. The Romans built their baths here not despite the natural hot springs, but because of them, working with what the earth offered rather than trying to impose something foreign upon it. There's wisdom in that approach, isn't there? This idea that healing comes not from forcing ourselves into shapes that don't fit, but from discovering what flows naturally when we stop fighting the current. As night deepens over the city, the marble begins to cool, though the thermal pools maintain their steady warmth. Steam rises like incense, carrying with it the mineral scent of deep earth and ancient water. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre plays a melody that seems to dance with the sound of flowing water, not competing with it, but joining it in something larger than either could create alone. This is the hour when day workers return to their homes, when the public spaces grow quiet, when the city begins to reveal its more intimate self. The hour when people stop performing for each other and start simply being with each other, when conversations turn from business and politics to the deeper questions. What does it mean to live well? How do we find peace in a world that seems designed to steal it from us? What remains when everything we thought we could control slips through our fingers like water? These are the questions that hover in the warm air of Hierapolis tonight. These are the whispers that echo off marble walls and limestone terraces, and these are the questions that will guide us as we follow one particular story. A story of transformation that began not with dramatic revelation, but with the simple recognition that sometimes our greatest strength lies not in what we can force to happen, but in how we choose to meet what happens to us. In the thermal pools, the water holds you without effort. You don't have to work to stay afloat. The mineral content makes buoyancy effortless. You can simply let go. Let the warm water support you while you gaze up at stars that have watched over countless generations of seekers, dreamers, and tired souls looking for a moment's peace. There's something profound about this experience of being held without having to earn it, of receiving support that asks nothing in return except that you allow yourself to receive it. It's a radical concept in a world that teaches us our worth depends on our productivity, our value on our usefulness to others. But here, in these ancient waters, a different truth emerges. The truth that you are worthy of care simply because you exist, that your need for rest and restoration isn't a weakness to be overcome, but a fundamental part of what makes you human, that the tender parts of yourself, the parts that feel too much, that care too deeply, that carry others' pain as if it were your own, these aren't flaws to be fixed, but gifts to be honored. The city of Hierapolis understood this. Built on the recognition that healing happens when we create spaces where people can set down their burdens without judgment, where they can remember who they are beneath all the roles they've learned to play, where they can practice the radical act of being kind to themselves. As we settle into this ancient landscape, as we breathe in air that carries the scent of mineral springs and night-blooming jasmine, we prepare to meet someone whose story will illuminate these truths in ways that still echo across the centuries. Someone who learned that the most profound freedom comes not from controlling our circumstances, but from understanding that we always have a choice in how we respond to them. Someone who discovered that inner peace isn't the absence of difficulty, but the presence of an unshakable knowing that you can meet whatever comes with dignity, with grace, with the quiet strength that flows from understanding your own true nature. The thermal pools continue their ancient song, water flowing over stone, carrying minerals from deep in the earth up to the surface where they can offer their healing gifts. And in this sound, in this eternal circulation of what lies hidden being brought to light, we find the perfect metaphor for the journey we're about to take together. A journey that begins here, in this city of whispers and wonder, where the earth itself teaches us about the power of gentle persistence, about the way transformation happens not through force, but through the patient, loving attention we bring to our own becoming. The story we're about to share unfolds in this very place, among these very pools, under these same stars. It's a story about finding unshakable peace in the midst of circumstances that would break most spirits. A story about discovering that true freedom lives not in what happens to us, but in the space between what happens and how we choose to respond. So breathe deeply. Let your shoulders drop and allow yourself to be held by these ancient waters as we begin. Dichotomy from Phrygia to Rome, a young life. The child who would become one of history's greatest teachers of inner freedom was born into a world where freedom seemed as distant as the stars themselves. In the rolling hills of Phrygia, in what we now call Turkey, a baby drew his first breath sometime around 50 CE. His parents likely never imagined that their son would one day teach emperors and slaves alike, that his words would echo through 20 centuries, that his name would become synonymous with unshakable peace. But perhaps that's always how it begins, isn't it? The most profound transformations often start in the most ordinary places. A kitchen table where someone finally says, "Enough." A morning commute where clarity suddenly breaks through the fog of routine. A child born into circumstances that would seem to limit everything, who would discover that nothing can truly limit the human spirit. His name was Epictetus, though we don't know what his parents called him in those early years. The name means acquired one, a designation that would come later, marking him as property rather than person. But in those first precious years, he was simply a child, running through olive groves, perhaps, listening to his mother's lullabies, watching his father's weathered hands work the land. The details of his childhood remain lost to time, like so many women's stories, so many ordinary lives that history deemed unworthy of recording. We can only imagine the moments that shaped him, the way light fell through their simple home, the stories shared around evening fires, the gradual understanding that the world beyond their hills was vast and often cruel. What we do know is that somehow, somewhere in those formative years, the seeds of his extraordinary wisdom were planted. Perhaps it was in watching his mother tend wounds with gentle hands while speaking words of comfort. Perhaps it was in observing how his father faced each day's hardships without bitterness, finding dignity in honest work. Or maybe it was simply in the quiet moments, those spaces between words where truth lives. But the peaceful rhythm of that early life was not destined to last. The Roman Empire was hungry, always hungry, for land, for resources, for human lives to fuel its endless expansion. When war came to Phrygia, it came like a sudden storm, sweeping away everything familiar and safe. We can picture the scene, can't we? The dust clouds on the horizon that meant soldiers were coming. The way conversation stopped mid-sentence as people strained to listen. The terrible choice that faced every family, to flee and lose everything or stay and risk capture. For young Epictetus and his family, there was no real choice at all. When the Roman legions arrived, they took what they wanted: land, goods, people. The boy who had run free through olive groves found himself bound for the greatest city in the world, not as a visitor or student, but as property. The journey to Rome was long and brutal. Imagine him, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, torn from everything he'd ever known, walking in chains toward an uncertain future. But even then, even in those darkest moments, something in him was observing, learning, beginning to understand that while his body could be enslaved, something deeper remained untouchable. Rome, when it finally rose before him, must have been overwhelming. The sheer scale of it, the noise, the crowds, the marble temples reaching toward the sky like frozen prayers. For a child from the quiet hills of Phrygia, it would have been like landing on another world entirely. This was the Rome of Nero's later years, a city drunk on its own power yet somehow hollow at its core. Wealth beyond imagination existed alongside grinding poverty. Magnificent art flourished while human beings were bought and sold like cattle. It was a place of stark contradictions, where the highest achievements of civilization existed alongside its deepest cruelties. And it was here that young Epictetus was sold to a man named Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was no ordinary Roman citizen. He served in the imperial household itself, first under Nero and later under Domitian. He was educated, cultured, wealthy, and like many Romans of his class, he collected human beings the way others might collect fine pottery or rare books. But in what might have been the first of many profound ironies in Epictetus's life, this enslavement became the doorway to an education he never could have received as a free boy from Phrygia. Epaphroditus, for all his moral blindness about slavery, valued learning. His household was filled with books, with conversation, with the ideas that shaped the Roman world. And so the young slave found himself in an extraordinary position, invisible enough to observe everything, yet present for discussions that would normally be reserved for the elite. He watched senators and philosophers debate in his master's home. He listened to readings from the great works of literature. He began to understand that there were different ways of seeing the world, different ways of being human. It was here, in the heart of the empire that had enslaved him, that Epictetus first encountered the teachings of the Stoics. These were philosophers who asked radical questions. What does it mean to be truly free? Where does real happiness come from? How do we find peace in a world we cannot control? For a young man who had lost everything external, family, homeland, freedom itself. These questions weren't academic exercises. They were matters of survival, of sanity, of discovering whether life had meaning beyond what could be taken or given by others. As he grew from boy to young man in Epaphroditus' household, Epictetus began to develop what would become his life's work, the understanding that true freedom exists in the space between what happens to us and how we choose to respond. That peace isn't found in controlling our circumstances, but in accepting what we cannot change while taking responsibility for what we can. The irony was profound. Here was a slave learning to be more free than his masters. A young man with no legal rights discovering rights that no law could grant or revoke. Someone society deemed worthless finding worth that no external force could diminish. And in the quiet moments, perhaps while tending to household duties or walking through Rome's bustling streets on errands, he was becoming the teacher who would one day show others how to find unshakable peace in the midst of any storm. Courtyard meditations, seeds of stoicism. The streets of Rome stretched endlessly before him, cobblestones worn smooth by countless feet, each carrying their own burdens, their own stories of struggle and hope. Epictetus walked these paths daily, moving between the market stalls and the grand houses, observing the theater of human emotion that played out in every corner of the eternal city. He began to notice patterns. The way merchants grew agitated when customers haggled too long, their faces reddening with frustration over circumstances they couldn't control. The way wealthy matrons fretted about dinner parties, their entire sense of worth hanging on whether the evening would unfold perfectly. The way senators paced their courtyards, consumed by political winds that shifted without warning or reason. And slowly, quietly, a different understanding began to take root in his mind. What if the secret wasn't in controlling these external forces at all? What if freedom lay somewhere else entirely? In the evenings, when his duties were complete, Epictetus would find quiet corners where he could think. Sometimes it was a small alcove in Epaphroditus' villa, sometimes a bench in a forgotten courtyard where moonlight filtered through olive branches. These became his classrooms, spaces where no formal teacher stood, but where wisdom seemed to whisper from the very stones. He thought about the conversations he'd overheard in his master's study. The Stoic philosophers spoke of something they called the inner citadel, a fortress within the soul that no external force could breach. At first, the concept had seemed abstract, almost mystical, but now, watching the daily dramas of Roman life unfold around him, he began to understand. The merchant's anger didn't come from the haggling customer. It came from his belief that he should be able to control that customer's behavior. The matron's anxiety didn't spring from the dinner party itself, but from her conviction that her happiness depended on everything going exactly as planned. The senator's worry wasn't really about political events. It was about his assumption that his peace of mind required those events to unfold according to his wishes. But what if they were all looking in the wrong direction? One particular evening stands out in the fragments of memory that have come down to us. Epictetus sat in a small garden behind the villa, watching water trickle from a simple fountain. The sound was gentle, constant, undisturbed by the chaos of the city beyond the walls. The water didn't fight against the stones that shaped its path. It didn't rage against gravity or demand that the fountain be different than it was. It simply flowed, finding its way with grace, adapting to each curve and channel, yet never losing its essential nature. And in that moment, something shifted. He saw it clearly. The difference between what was up to him and what was not up to him. The distinction that would later become the cornerstone of everything he taught. The water's path through the fountain, not up to the water, but how the water moved along that path, completely within its nature. The stones in his own life, his slavery, his master's moods, the political upheavals of Rome, the opinions others held about him. None of these were up to him, but his response to them, his thoughts about them, his judgments, his inner stance. These belonged entirely to him. This realization didn't come with trumpets or dramatic revelation. It settled over him like evening light, gradual, natural, transforming everything it touched. He began to practice this new understanding in small ways. When Epictetus was particularly demanding, instead of feeling resentment, Epictetus would remind himself, "This situation is not up to me, but my response is." When other slaves complained bitterly about their circumstances, he would listen with compassion while inwardly noting, their suffering comes not from their slavery alone, but from their belief that things should be different than they are. This wasn't passive acceptance or resignation. It was something far more powerful, the recognition of where his true freedom lay. He discovered that he could stand in the same room as his master and occupy completely different worlds. Epictetus might be agitated about some business matter, pacing and cursing the unfairness of his situation, but Epictetus could remain centered, present, unshaken. Not because his circumstances were better, but because he had learned to distinguish between the storm and the sky that contains it. The storms would always come. Business would fluctuate, people would disappoint, bodies would age, empires would rise and fall, but the sky, the vast open awareness within which all these changes occurred, that remained constant, untouchable, free. Word began to spread quietly among the household staff. There was something different about the young slave from Phrygia. He carried himself with unusual dignity, spoke with uncommon wisdom, and seemed to possess a kind of peace that external circumstances couldn't disturb. Other slaves sought him out during rest periods, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. He would share what he was learning. Not as a teacher yet, but as a fellow traveler who had glimpsed a different way of moving through the world. "We suffer not from what happens to us," he would say quietly, "but from our judgments about what happens to us." "But surely," someone would protest, "slavery is genuinely difficult. Poverty is truly hard. Illness really does cause pain." "Yes," he would agree, "these things are challenging. But notice, when you lie awake at night worrying, is your suffering coming from the difficulty itself or from your thoughts about it, from your belief that it shouldn't be happening, from your fear of what others will think, from your conviction that you can't handle it?" These conversations happened in whispers, in stolen moments between duties, but they were planting seeds, ideas that would eventually grow into teachings that would echo across centuries. Epictetus began to see his slavery differently, not as something to celebrate or passively endure, but as a particularly clear classroom for learning about freedom. Because when your external circumstances are so obviously beyond your control, you're forced to look elsewhere for your sense of agency and dignity. He realized that many free Romans were more enslaved than he was, chained to their reputations, their possessions, their need for others' approval, their terror of loss or change. They had more choices about where to go and what to do, but they were prisoners of their own minds, constantly agitated by forces beyond their control. True freedom, he was discovering, had nothing to do with external circumstances and everything to do with the sovereignty of the inner realm. This understanding brought him a peace that others noticed. Not the peace of someone who had given up, but the deep calm of someone who had found solid ground beneath his feet, ground that couldn't be bought or sold, granted or revoked, praised or criticized out of existence. As months passed into years, Epictetus continued to refine this practice. He learned to catch his mind when it wandered into territory that wasn't his to control. He developed what would later become his famous discipline of desire, the art of wanting what happens rather than demanding that what he wanted should happen. This didn't make him passive or indifferent. If anything, it freed him to respond more skillfully to each situation. When you're not wasting energy fighting reality or trying to control the uncontrollable, you have more resources available for the things that actually are within your influence. And slowly, quietly, in the heart of the empire that had enslaved his body, Epictetus was becoming the freest man in Rome. The irony would have made him smile if anyone had pointed it out to him then, but he was too busy learning, too absorbed in the daily practice of this new way of being, to notice the profound transformation taking place within him. He was becoming a philosopher, not through formal study or academic debate, but through the lived experience of finding unshakable peace in the midst of circumstances that would have driven most people to despair. The banishment and a new beginning. But freedom, true freedom, often comes in ways we never expect. The year was 93 AD when the whispers began spreading through the streets of Rome like ripples across still water. Emperor Domitian, growing ever more suspicious and tyrannical in his later years, had turned his attention to the philosophers. They talk too much about virtue, he declared, about inner strength and moral courage, about loyalties that transcended the whims of emperors. They were dangerous. Epictetus, now in his 40s, heard the news with the same calm acceptance he had cultivated for decades. The emperor had issued a decree. All philosophers were to be banished from Rome, not executed, not imprisoned, simply sent away, like dust swept from a marble floor. The irony was not lost on him. After 30 years of physical bondage followed by years of quiet teaching, he was being exiled for the very wisdom that had already set him free. Some of his fellow philosophers raged against the injustice. Others pleaded their cases to influential friends, seeking exemptions or delays. A few went into hiding, hoping the emperor's attention would turn elsewhere. But Epictetus simply began to pack. His possessions fit easily into a single bag, a few scrolls, a worn cloak, some basic necessities, the accumulation of a lifetime that could be carried by one person without strain. As he prepared to leave the only free life he had ever known in Rome, his students gathered around him. Some were weeping, others angry on his behalf, all of them uncertain about what would come next. "Teacher," one of them asked, "how can you be so calm? They are taking everything from you." Epictetus paused in his packing and looked at the young man with gentle eyes. "Are they taking my ability to think clearly?" he asked. "No, but are they taking my capacity for kindness, my understanding of what truly matters?" The student shook his head. "Are they taking my freedom to choose how I respond to this moment?" "No." "Then they are taking nothing that belongs to me," Epictetus said simply. "Everything else, the buildings, the familiar streets, even this particular gathering of minds, these were never truly mine to begin with. They were gifts, temporarily given. Now they are being temporarily taken away." He smiled, and there was something luminous in his expression. "Besides, perhaps this exile is not an ending. Perhaps it is an invitation." And so, in the autumn of 93 AD, Epictetus left Rome, not as a broken man driven from his home, but as a philosopher following the next turn in his path. He traveled northwest, across mountains and valleys, until he reached the city of Nicopolis in Epirus. The name meant City of Victory, and it had been founded by Augustus Caesar to commemorate his triumph at the nearby Battle of Actium. But for Epictetus, it would become the site of a different kind of victory, the triumph of wisdom over circumstance, of teaching over silence, of building something beautiful from the raw materials of exile. Nicopolis was smaller than Rome, quieter, with less of the frenetic energy that had characterized the capital. The pace of life moved more slowly here. There was space to think, space to breathe, space to plant seeds that might grow into something extraordinary. Epictetus found modest lodgings and began, almost immediately, to teach again. At first, it was just a few curious locals who had heard rumors about the philosopher from Rome. They gathered in a simple room, sitting on wooden benches, listening as this unassuming man with the gentle voice shared insights that seemed to illuminate the very foundations of human experience. But word travels quickly in smaller cities. Within months, students were arriving from across the Greek world, young men who had heard whispers of a teacher who could show them how to find unshakable peace in an uncertain world. They came seeking answers to the questions that keep us awake at night. How do we find meaning when life feels chaotic? How do we maintain our sense of self when everything around us is changing? How do we love without losing ourselves? How do we serve without being consumed? Epictetus welcomed them all. He established what would become one of the most influential philosophical schools of the ancient world, not in grand buildings or marble halls, but in simple rooms where minds could meet and wisdom could be shared like bread broken among friends. His teaching method was unlike anything his students had experienced. He didn't lecture from scrolls or recite ancient texts. Instead, he engaged them in dialogue, asking questions that helped them discover truths for themselves. "What disturbed you today?" he might ask a student who arrived looking troubled. "My father criticized my choices," the young man would reply. "And what exactly disturbed you about that? His words or your thoughts about his words?" Slowly, gently, he would guide them to see the distinction between external events and internal responses, between what happens to us and what we make it mean. He taught them that we cannot control what others say or do, but we can always control how we choose to interpret and respond to their actions, that our peace of mind is not dependent on getting the approval we crave or avoiding the criticism we fear. These were not abstract philosophical concepts to Epictetus. They were practical tools for daily living, forged in the fires of his own experience and tested through decades of practice. His students learned to see challenges as opportunities to strengthen their character, setbacks as chances to practice resilience, criticism as information that might or might not be useful, but never as a verdict on their worth as human beings. They learned that happiness is not something that happens to us when circumstances align perfectly, but something we create through our choices, moment by moment, breath by breath. The school in Nicopolis became a sanctuary for souls who had grown weary of trying to control the uncontrollable, a place where people could learn to set down burdens they had never realized they were carrying. Students would arrive tense and anxious, their minds spinning with worries about the future and regrets about the past. They would leave with a different quality of presence, calmer, more centered, more genuinely free. Word of the school spread throughout the Roman world. Patricians and plebeians, merchants and soldiers, artists and administrators, they all found their way to this quiet city where a former slave was teaching the art of inner liberation. Epictetus had been banished from Rome as a dangerous philosopher. In Nicopolis, he became something far more subversive, a teacher of joy, a guide who could show others how to find unshakable peace in the midst of any storm. The exile that was meant to silence him had instead given him the perfect stage for his most important work. Sometimes the very thing that seems to be taking everything away is actually clearing space for something more beautiful than we ever imagined possible. Sometimes banishment is just another word for freedom. Hierapolis, echoes of wisdom, teaching in Nicopolis. The school that emerged in Nicopolis was unlike anything the Roman world had seen before. Where other philosophical academies focused on abstract debates and intellectual competitions, Epictetus created something entirely different, a sanctuary, a place where wounded souls could come to remember their own strength. Picture the setting, a modest building overlooking the Ionian Sea where morning light filtered through simple windows onto worn wooden benches. No marble statues or gilded decorations, no pretense, just space and silence, and the gentle presence of a teacher who had learned to find freedom in the most unlikely places. Students came from across the empire, senators and slaves, merchants and soldiers, women disguised as men so they could access wisdom that Roman society said wasn't meant for them, all drawn by whispers of a teacher who could show them how to be truly free. Epictetus would begin each day before dawn, not with grand lectures, but with quiet observation. He watched his students arrive carrying their invisible burdens, the weight of expectations, the exhaustion of trying to control things that couldn't be controlled, the deep tiredness that comes from fighting battles that were never theirs to fight. He saw himself in every face. "Tell me," he would say gently to a new arrival, "what brought you here?" And they would pour out their stories. The senator overwhelmed by political pressures he couldn't navigate, the merchant's wife trapped in a marriage that felt like a cage, the young soldier terrified of battles yet to come, the mother who had lost a child and couldn't find her way back to hope. Epictetus listened to each story with the patience of someone who understood that pain shared is pain transformed. Then, in his quiet voice, he would begin to teach. There are things within our control, he would say, and things outside our control. Within our control are our opinion, motivation, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever is of our own doing. Not within our control are our body, our property, reputation, position, and, in a word, whatever is not of our own doing. Simple words, but revolutionary. He wasn't asking them to become indifferent to life. He was showing them how to engage with life from a place of inner strength rather than desperate need. "You are not your circumstances," he would remind them. "You are not your reputation, your possessions, or even your relationships. You are the consciousness that chooses how to respond to all of these things, and that can never be taken from you." The teaching happened everywhere, during morning walks along the coast, over simple meals, in quiet conversations that stretched into the evening hours. Epictetus had learned that wisdom isn't something you acquire in formal lectures. It's something you absorb through relationship, through example, through the slow transformation that happens when you spend time with someone who has found genuine peace. Among his students was a young Roman named Arrian, bright, dedicated, and blessed with an unusual gift, the ability to capture not just Epictetus's words, but the essence of his teaching. While others took notes on wax tablets, Arrian seemed to absorb the very spirit of what was being shared. He watched his teacher with fascination. Here was a man who had lost everything the world said mattered: freedom, status, physical comfort, and yet radiated a contentment that the most powerful Romans could never achieve. "Master," Arrian asked one evening as they sat watching the sunset paint the sea in shades of gold, "how do you remain so peaceful when the world is full of so much suffering?" Epictetus smiled. "I have learned the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is what happens to us. Suffering is what we add to pain through our resistance, our demands that reality be different than it is." He gestured toward the horizon. "The sun sets every evening. I can rage against the darkness, spend my energy cursing the loss of light, or I can appreciate the beauty of twilight and rest in the promise that dawn will come again. But surely, Arian pressed gently, there are things worth fighting for? Injustices that should make us angry? Of course, Epictetus replied, but there's a difference between taking right action from a place of clarity and taking desperate action from a place of emotional chaos. When we're centered, when we're at peace with what is, we can actually be more effective agents of positive change. This was perhaps his most radical teaching. That acceptance didn't mean passivity, that inner peace wasn't indifference, that you could care deeply about the world while remaining unshaken by its storms. Night after night, Arian carefully recorded these conversations. He captured not just the philosophy, but the humanity behind it. The way Epictetus would pause to comfort a student who was struggling, the gentle humor he used to deflate pretension, the infinite patience he showed to those who came to him, broken and searching. "You are writing something important," Epictetus told him one day, "not because my words are particularly wise, but because people need to remember that peace is possible, that freedom is always available, that no matter what has been taken from them, the most essential part of who they are remains untouchable." Arian nodded, understanding the weight of what he was preserving. These weren't just philosophical concepts, they were lifelines, tools for survival, maps for finding your way back to yourself when the world tried to convince you that you were lost. The school in Nicopolis became legendary, not for its grandeur, but for its transformation. Students arrived carrying the weight of the world and learned to set it down. They came seeking answers to impossible questions and found instead a different way of being with the questions themselves. They learned that happiness wasn't something to be pursued, but something that emerged naturally when you stopped chasing what you couldn't control and started nurturing what you could. They discovered that strength wasn't about never falling down, but about knowing that you could always choose to get back up. They found that freedom wasn't about having no constraints, but about understanding that your essential self existed beyond all constraints. Most importantly, they learned that peace wasn't something you had to earn or achieve. It was something you could choose in any moment, regardless of circumstances. And in a small room overlooking the sea, a former slave taught the world that the most profound revolution wasn't about changing what happened to you. It was about changing how you chose to meet what happened to you. Sometimes the greatest teachers are those who have learned their lessons in the hardest classrooms. Sometimes wisdom is born not from having all the answers, but from learning to be at peace with the questions. The enduring legacy, Arian's gift. And so it was that in those quiet evenings in Nicopolis, as the Mediterranean whispered against the shore, something extraordinary was being born. Not in grand halls or marble academies, but in the simple act of one student refusing to let wisdom disappear into silence. Arian understood something that perhaps even his teacher did not fully grasp at the time. He understood that words spoken in one moment, words that touched one heart, changed one mind, offered peace to one troubled soul. Those words deserved to live beyond that moment. Night after night, by flickering lamplight, Arian's stylus moved across wax tablets, not to capture mere philosophy, but to preserve the very voice of the man who had learned freedom in chains, the cadence of Epictetus's speech, the gentle humor that could make the deepest truths feel like conversations with a beloved friend, the way he could take the weight of the world and somehow make it lighter. What disturbs people's minds, Epictetus would say, and Arian would carefully record each word, is not events but their judgments on events. Simple words, revolutionary truth. Arian was creating something the world had never quite seen before, not a formal treatise written by a scholar for scholars, but the living voice of a teacher speaking directly to the human heart. The discourses would capture the full conversations, the back and forth between teacher and student, the real questions that real people brought to this sanctuary by the sea, and then the Enchiridion, the handbook. 53 brief chapters that distilled a lifetime of wisdom into something you could carry with you always, something small enough to fit in your traveling pack, profound enough to change your life. Some things are within our power, it would begin, while others are not. 8 words that would echo through centuries, 8 words that would offer peace to countless souls who had never heard of a lame slave in a Greek coastal town. But here's what moves me most about Arrian's gift to us. He didn't try to improve upon his teacher's words. He didn't add his own interpretations or scholarly commentary. He simply listened, truly listened, and then he made sure we could listen too. In a world where everyone wanted to add their own voice to the conversation, Arrian chose to amplify someone else's. In a world where credit and recognition mattered so much, he chose to step back and let his teacher's light shine. The scrolls would travel first to Rome, where they were copied by scribes who recognized their value, then to Alexandria, where they found their way into the great library, to Athens, where philosophers debated their meaning, to distant provinces, where Roman officials, far from home and struggling with the weight of their responsibilities, found comfort in these ancient words. Centuries would pass. The Roman Empire would fall. Languages would change. Entire civilizations would rise and disappear. But somehow these words would survive. Medieval monks would copy them by candlelight, preserving them through the Dark Ages. Renaissance scholars would rediscover them, finding in Stoic wisdom a bridge between ancient and modern thought. Enlightenment thinkers would debate them. Modern psychologists would recognize in them the seeds of cognitive therapy. And today, a tired woman lying in bed at the end of another overwhelming day can still hear Epictetus whispering across the centuries, "You are not your circumstances. You are how you choose to meet your circumstances." This is the miracle that Arrian made possible, not just the preservation of ideas, but the preservation of hope itself, the proof that wisdom doesn't have to die with the wise, that peace, once discovered, can be passed from heart to heart, across any distance, through any darkness. Think of all the people who have found refuge in these words. The soldier, far from home, reading by firelight. The mother overwhelmed by responsibilities, finding strength in the reminder that she can only control her own actions, her own responses. The person facing loss, discovering that grief and peace can somehow coexist. The executive learning that success and failure are both just events, and that her worth lies not in outcomes she cannot control, but in the integrity and effort she brings to each moment. The teenager struggling with anxiety, finding freedom in the radical idea that other people's opinions are not up to her. All of this because one student cared enough to listen, really listen, and then to make sure that listening could continue long after the original voice had grown silent. In our age of endless noise, when everyone speaks and few truly hear, Arrian's example feels almost revolutionary. He reminds us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is not to add our voice to the chaos, but to help someone else's wisdom find its way to the hearts that need it most. He reminds us that love sometimes looks like preservation, that devotion sometimes looks like stepping aside, that the greatest gift we can give might not be our own brilliant thoughts, but our willingness to make space for someone else's light to shine. And so tonight, as you settle into rest, carry with you this gentle truth. Your listening matters. Your attention is a gift. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply receive the wisdom that's being offered to you. Let it in. Let it settle. Let it become part of who you are. Finding freedom within, a final reflection. And in this quiet space between waking and dreaming, we can see how one man's journey from slavery to freedom became a gift that has echoed across 2,000 years, reaching you tonight in your own moment of seeking rest and peace. Epictetus never wrote a single word himself, yet his voice speaks to us still through the devoted listening of a student who understood that some truths are too precious to let fade into silence. His teachings about inner freedom, about the gentle art of distinguishing between what we can and cannot control, about finding unshakable peace in the midst of life's storms. These weren't abstract philosophies debated in marble halls, but lived wisdom born from the deepest struggles a human soul can face. From that small boy in Phrygia, who learned early that the world could be harsh and unpredictable, to the slave in Rome, who discovered that no one could chain his thoughts or his spirit, to the exiled teacher who transformed banishment into opportunity, to the gentle guide who showed countless students how to find their own inner sanctuary. Epictetus's life was a testament to something profound and beautiful, that our circumstances need not define our peace. Tonight, as you rest in your own bed, in your own life with its own particular challenges and burdens, you can carry this ancient wisdom with you. The understanding that while you cannot control what others do or say, while you cannot control the demands placed upon you or the expectations that seem to multiply each day, while you cannot control the endless stream of comparisons and performances that modern life seems to require, you can always return to that quiet place within yourself where your true freedom lives. This is what Epictetus discovered in those thermal pools of Hierapolis, in the bustling streets of Rome, in the peaceful groves of his school in Nicopolis. That freedom isn't about changing our external circumstances, though sometimes we can. Freedom is about remembering who we are beneath all the roles we play, all the masks we wear, all the ways we stretch ourselves thin, trying to be everything to everyone. You are not your productivity. You are not your achievements or your failures. You are not the sum of other people's opinions or expectations. You are not even your own harsh inner critic that whispers that you're not doing enough, not being enough, not giving enough. You are something deeper, something that cannot be touched by the chaos and demands of daily life, something that remains whole and worthy and at peace no matter what storms rage around you. And perhaps this is why Epictetus's teachings have survived when so many other voices from antiquity have been lost to time. Because this truth he discovered, this gentle art of inner freedom, is something every human soul recognizes when they hear it. It's the wisdom your grandmother might have whispered to you about not letting others steal your joy. It's the deep knowing that you've always carried that your worth isn't dependent on your performance. It's the quiet voice that sometimes surfaces in moments like this, when the day's demands finally quiet, reminding you that you are enough, exactly as you are. The students who traveled from across the Roman Empire to study with Epictetus, they weren't so different from you, settling into rest tonight. They were people carrying burdens, people exhausted from trying to control things beyond their reach, people who had forgotten how to find peace in their own skin. And what they learned in those gentle conversations under the olive trees wasn't complicated or mystical. They learned to breathe. They learned to pause before reacting. They learned to ask themselves, is this something I can actually control? And if the answer was no, they learned to let it go with the same grace that Epictetus showed when he was banished from Rome. This is the gift that Arrian preserved for us in his careful, loving transcription of his teacher's words. Not a rigid system of rules or a demanding philosophy that requires perfection, but a gentle way of moving through the world that honors both our human limitations and our infinite capacity for inner peace. Tonight, you can practice this ancient art of freedom. When your mind starts to spin with tomorrow's worries or today's regrets, you can return to your breath, to this moment, to the simple truth that you are here. You are safe. You are enough. When the voices of comparison start their familiar chorus, you can remember Epictetus's gentle teaching that your worth has nothing to do with how you measure against others. When the weight of others' emotions threatens to pull you under, you can practice the loving boundary of caring without carrying, of being present without being responsible for everyone else's peace. These aren't just beautiful ideas to contemplate. They are practices, as real and practical as the thermal springs that drew pilgrims to Hierapolis, as concrete as the stone benches where Epictetus taught his students, as immediate as your own breath moving in and out of your body right now. And so as we come to the end of this journey together, as your eyes grow heavy and your body settles deeper into rest, let yourself receive this final gift from across the centuries. The understanding that you have everything you need within you to find peace, to choose freedom, to live with the kind of gentle strength that no external circumstance can shake. That the same wisdom that transformed a slave into one of history's greatest teachers of freedom lives within you too, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be practiced, waiting to carry you through whatever tomorrow may bring. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your muscles release their hold on the day's tensions. Let your mind settle into the quiet, knowing that you are held, you are seen, you are enough, and that somewhere in the eternal realm where all true wisdom lives, an ancient teacher smiles with recognition at another soul finding their way home to peace.